All right, I'm sitting here with Trent Salo. We've tried to do this podcast for a long time now. I feel like it's been many months. But I went out to Traverse City to see your tendon lab and spend some time with you recently. But yeah, we're going to get into a lot of things, Achilles and Patellar. Why don't you tell everyone who you are?
Sure. Appreciate the opportunity, Jake. Yeah. From Northern Michigan, grew up in Northern Michigan, Upper Peninsula to be exact. So you're from Minnesota, right, Jake?
Yeah, Wisconsin. So
Or
I could
Wisconsin?
I could
Yep.
drive through the UP actually. Yeah.
Yeah. So when I say Uper, you know what I'm talking about. So anyways, I played three sports in high school, kept me out of trouble. Went on to play collegiate basketball, walk on at a D2 school, ended up transferring to D3. So played for the love of the game, wanted to get to the NBA as a player. Unfortunately, I'm about 5'7" on a good day. And so that definitely wasn't happening. So knew I had to develop a unique skill set just to try to get to the NBA as a staff member. And so where that led me, spent some time down in Kentucky, University of Kentucky, more of a strength and conditioning focus. And then from there went on to Florida, so St. Augustine, Florida, for physical therapy school. So grew my hair out, learned how to surf, lived a mile from the beach, a fun time. So yeah, man, from there, almost a decade in professional basketball, was, right place, right time, a lot of luck involved, but was able to work my way up. Had roles in the NBA as a strength and conditioning coach, physical therapist, and then most recently more in an executive level role. Multiple tendon experiences with players in my time in the NBA. And so I really knew early on that I would always want to specialize in tendons whenever we got kicked out of the NBA or we decided to leave. And so last year we decided to actually walk away from basketball. I got two young kids at home. And so full circle, we moved back to Northern Michigan, Traverse City, Michigan, and opened up a specialized tendon practice, which is called the Tendon Lab, and essentially consists of some consulting work and some clinical work. Also enrolled in a PhD program with Peter Magnuson, who I consider sort of the OG in tendon research at the University of Copenhagen. So we've got some cool research teed up with IMG Academy down in Bradenton. And really, I spend my days with clinical care, some consulting, and some research, plus planning a tendon event here that we're going to host in April up here. So yeah, started recently just jumping on some podcasts to improve my circle of competence, if you will. There's reading a book, Shane Parrish. I don't know if you've heard of Shane, but he has a mental models book, and he talks about to build and maintain a circle of competence. You need to have a curiosity and desire to learn, and monitor your track record honestly, and get feedback. Just because we have bias, and so I just bring that up because part of my motivation for jumping on some of these podcasts is to get feedback on areas that I'm wrong, so I can improve upon that maybe on the next podcast. So, anyways, long-winded answer, man, but that's who I am and where I'm at.
Why didn't you want to do college strength?
I got started in college. I mean, at the D3 level, we didn't have a strength coach. So I was that guy forcing my teammates to, lift and condition. And then in physical therapy school, there's a university, a D2 school in St. Augustine called Flagler. And so a mentor of mine was the head guy there. And so I would go in and actually work with the basketball team throughout physical therapy school, just because have a medical license, but I feel the most comfortable in a weight room. And really, I just wanted to get to the NBA. Grew up watching the NBA. So for whatever reason, got some reps in college, but that was always the goal.
Mm-hmm. And then who are you? So who are you with in the NBA? You started with Charlotte, or I've seen on your Instagram you're kind of multiple places.
Yeah, so Grand Rapids, it was formerly the Grand Rapids Drive. It's now the Grand Rapids Gold. It's the Denver Nuggets G League team. So again, right place, right time. Cut my teeth there as a strength and conditioning coach. From there, went over to the Detroit Pistons for the bulk of my career, which is really cool, man. I grew up rooting for the Pistons, and obviously the rich tradition and history, and I love to see what they're doing now recently. And then, 2 years ago or 2 summers ago, whatever it was, I had an opportunity to go to Charlotte. And so moved to Charlotte, got a house down there. Phenomenal experience, great people down in Charlotte. So they've been on a winning streak lately too. So yeah, those three organizations.
Okay, and take me back to when, because now you're all in attendance, but when you had issues back then, what were you guys doing? What maybe even like what made you decide I'm gonna go out on my own and do tendons?
Like I mentioned, I debated a PhD for the last 5 years, and it was either skill acquisition because I love that space, or tendons, which are two sort of different. Anyways, early on in the MBA, we had a difficult patellar tendon case, and we sought out some help from a physio from London, who you've had on the podcast, Jared. And so Jared came over and we got to talking, and he introduced me to UTC, some of the loading protocols, some of which we were trialing. Um, but then, that experience with him, it just sparked curiosity to go even deeper. Just because, again, it was a traditional, eccentric loading, or, heavy, slow loading, and that's all you do, and there's nothing else. And, we don't image tendons, and if it doesn't work, you just go get 10x. And so anyways, that was a instrumental sort of launch pad into my curiosity. And that just, similar to you, probably just going deeper and learning more and reading everything I can get my hands on. And then having multiple other experiences like that in professional basketball was really cool. So again, I knew that I wanted to go deeper, where in sport, again, you were a strength coach, so like, how it is, you have to be a generalist to some degree, where a little bit, knowing a little bit about everything that can then impact performance. Where I've always had this desire to go really deep on a topic, which is also part of the reason I hesitated to do podcasts early on. Is I felt if I did a podcast on a topic that would be boxed in or labeled as that guy, I'm like, oh, you're that guy, you did a podcast on it. So now it's like, no, I want to do a podcast on tendons because that's how I spend my days.
Uh-huh. Um, so you guys seek out Jared to help you with that case. If you didn't have Jared, what were you guys leaning towards? Was it the old school stuff like the single leg decline squats, and or what were you guys thinking?
Yeah, good question. I'm getting old. I turned 38 last month, so my memory might be a little hazy way back then. But again, not getting into details of the specific case per se, but I think it was just at a point where decisions had to be made, and we wanted somebody because we have a framework that, wisdom of crowds. And so if we have a tendon issue, why would we not want to talk to the guy who looks at tendons all day? Or we have a bone issue, why not talk to the guy who looks at bone all day? And so for me, having that early on, even though working in sports, sometimes you, you have folks that, I know it all, I don't need help, like I've got this, don't worry about it. That wasn't me. And whether that's the right way or wrong way, whatever. I just felt like leaning on experts to help inform some of the decision making was important.
Um, okay. Before I get to the tendon lab, you're doing research at IMG. What are you guys doing there?
Yeah, so just getting started with that. It's funny, man. Just going, I'm one of the first non-resident PhD students that Peter's taken on, and he's phenomenal, by the way. But part of the learning curve is just being able to collect data in the States, and making sure we have everything tied up from an IRB, that sort of thing. So, anyways, we'll get it kicked off as a simple, updated prevalence study. I say simple, it's not so simple, but just getting better understanding of how prevalent or how common Achilles and patellar tendon issues are in a basketball specific cohort, adolescent basketball specific cohort. So there has been some literature done on this already, but we want to get some updated numbers, simply because some of the literature has, had a heterogeneous population, or how they've diagnosed it has been different in some of these papers. And so, again, just getting my feet wet. I've had one published paper way back in PT school, but I'm really excited to get going and develop as a researcher and scientist.
Okay, yeah. Um, all right. So I came out to Tendon Lab, and I mean, you got quite a bit of stuff going on there. Um, when someone comes to you with Achilles, patellar, what does this process look like for you?
Yeah, when somebody comes into the tendon lab, I think it's first important to start with, just defining tendon health, which is a little off topic, but somewhat related. And I guess I'll explain why. But, you know, everybody talks about tendon health, and you're doing isometrics to improve tendon health, or I need to improve, tendon health by doing X, Y, Z. And so I bring that up because starting the tendon lab, for me, it was important to get a better understanding of, what are the domains that go into tendon health? How are we operationally defining tendon health? And so, I look at it as a multidimensional construct composed of these domains that, collectively define tissue capacity, where, health is maybe an alignment between the capacity and the environmental demand, plus, weighted by what the individual cares about. So the Delaware group, Sean Hanlon, I think Carr and Silbernagel was a part of that, but they put out this Achilles tendon health model where they have these intrinsic factors and, personal factors and symptoms, function, structure, and psychological factors, I think were the five. Um, and so for me, starting with an understanding of, okay, what goes into quote unquote tendon health? Uh, and working backwards from that and figuring out how I wanted to assess somebody when they came in. The basic psychological factors would include questionnaires. And so when people come in, they're filling out questionnaires. They're getting, giving a history of have they taken, fluoroquinolones recently, although I know that's being debated based on some of the tweets I've seen at Sports Congress, metabolic health, that sort of thing. Um, from there, we look at structure, we look at function, and we look at mechanical properties. And so those are sort of the big three that we would evaluate coming into the tendon lab. Again, all this is built upon what the individual wants to get back to, because I do think when we define tendon health, it needs to be contextually specific. Are they a sedentary, older individual that just wants to be able to walk pain-free, or is it an elite basketball player who wants to be able to decelerate into a pull-up jump shot effectively without tendon pain? So I think those are two very different examples, and I think they require, while overlapping, different approaches per se. So again, the specifics, the structure piece, we have UTC. So, my bias is towards using ultrasound and ultrasound tissue characterization to get a better understanding of the current status of the tendon or structure of the tendon. Mechanical property piece, we don't have shear wave, but we do have something called the Myoton Pro device. And the Myoton Pro is it's from Estonia. It looks at it looks at compressive stiffness, where it's basically like an algometer where it applies an impulse transversely to the tissue. It measures the response of the tissue, and it provides an objective measurement of that. And so we use the Myoton Pro to quantify stiffness at various locations throughout the tendon, and then a function standpoint. And so the way that I'm defining function is, we look at different components of muscle tendon unit function. Something simple like an isometric seated plantar flexion test on the force plates. So we have Vald and Hawken plates actually, but we primarily use the Vald for assessing seated isometric strength. I know there's some debate with, seated versus standing and training and testing, blah, 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 but we elect to go with the seated simply because there's less degrees of freedom. It's a bit easier to reproduce in my opinion. So if we had a HUMAC or isokinetic, we would use that, but for now we have the Vald plates. So function consists of max isometric strength. We look at explosive strength, where if you look at some of Lachlan James's work, and force at less than 150 milliseconds is actually a different measure than max or peak strength or peak force, excuse me. So again, it could be a little messy if somebody's untrained and hasn't done that before, but that would be another metric that we would look at for function. We do a repeat hop test just to look at elasticity or reactive strength. We also do a single leg CMJ to look at dynamic strength or power. And then we also we finish with a heel raise endurance test off of a decline. So just using the calf raise app. I know there's some people that use the various other linear encoders, but I've elected just to use the heel raise endurance app just to get a measure of somebody's strength endurance. So long answer, but to summarize, it's first defining tendon health, getting an understanding of this contextual situation. What does this person care about? What do they want to get back to? Getting an understanding of their psychological, where they're at psychologically, getting an intake from a questionnaire standpoint, getting an understanding of their past medical history, and then getting into some of these objective testing. And that consists of the structure, the mechanical properties, and the function. So I'll stop there. I know it's a
Yeah,
lot.
yeah. So, structure and mechanical properties, are those like synonymous for you?
Yeah,
Or
man.
okay,
If you look in the literature, they're not synonymous in how I think about it, but my brain is very simple in the sense of how I bucket things, and structure to me is um, you know ultrasound, MRI, like getting an understanding of what's going on in the tissue. Whereas the mechanical properties, it's your tensiometry, your elastography, your myoton pro, basically what how the tissue is responding per se.
Okay. Um, yeah, okay, so you showed me this Myoton Pro. I don't think you did. Is this like a recent thing they're using to look at tendons, or has this been around for a while?
My understanding is that it initially started for muscles, and some of the early research was less than 10 years ago. Uh, as of late, the last 5-ish years, we've seen more come out on tendons, particularly Achilles tendon and patellar tendon. And so the value is ease of use, um, and cost comparative to shear wave. And so initially was exposed to this when I visited Karin in Delaware. One of her postdoc students, Tomo Ishigaki, had recently had a study looking at compressive versus tensile stiffness. I think it was published just a few months ago, actually. But anyways, and so I spoke with him to get an understanding of, you know, how we're defining tensile stiffness and compressive stiffness, and who cares, measuring one versus the other. How do we measure one versus the other? When would each apply? And so again, while I have some experience, at least getting shear wave done on myself, I don't have any experience actually conducting shear wave or tensiometry. um, and it was appealing for me, A, because it's a newer device that does need some more literature behind it, and B, just again, the ease of use in the clinic, where I can take every interaction with a client, and while I feel good about what we're doing, I'm also conducting some research in a way. And so I'm able to compare, particularly what is the structural disorganization directly over the place where the Myotown Pro says it's the least stiff, which that would match my bias of the tendon becoming more compliant or less stiff in a tendinopathic state, for example. So yeah, it hasn't been around very long. I think it's slowly starting to catch on from a tendon standpoint. Um, there are some limitations with it, just because it has an upper limit. And so it does have to be at rest. And so we're measuring the Achilles in a prone position, with the ankle in neutral, where even if you flex the ankle or dorsiflex the ankle at 90 degrees, or sorry, neutral, um, your stiffness measures change drastically, just because you're passively causing some strain or tension in that tendon. And there is an upper limit with this device. So more research needed. But again, part of what I'm trying to do is blend these worlds of clinical care in the trenches and research.
Okay, so the UTC scan. Um, yeah, I mean, you did it on when I was out there. You did it on my right Achilles, which was a little bit symptomatic, and you saw some structural problems, and then my left patellar, and that would look like a mess. I had never got a UTC scan done on it, but um, it was ever since I talked to Jared, that was the first time I kind of became aware of this UTC scan. Uh, Tell me your story. How did you end up? Do you have one in your clinic, and you can scan people with this and get a really in-depth look at the structure of the tendon? Yeah, how did you get to this point?
Structure's so divisive at times. And so it's funny, even, when people start bringing up UTC, it's like, oh man, how do I frame this? So we don't create these tribes or camps when it comes to structure evaluation. So I'm going to do my best to, obviously just share how I came across it, but then also just some thoughts on how we can try to continue to ask some better questions. So yeah, Jared introduced me to it in that first case, way back when. And since then, read all of the early studies on it, and pros and cons, and spoke with the group at UTC over in the Netherlands, and, eventually wanted to, we decided to get one in Detroit with our health system. And so, we had a UTC system maybe 4 or 5 years ago with the Pistons, and, just upskilling myself. Jared was instrumental in teaching me how to use it. A lot of trialing and scanning myself, which is challenging. A lot of our video room staff. And so it attracted me simply because the way they described it is, using B mode, while extremely valuable, you're having to save the images in your head as you're scanning somebody. Whereas with UTC, you're able to set it on there, push a button. The computer collects 600 images every 0.2 millimeters and overlays it on one another. And you're able to quantify the tendon structure and discriminate the aligned fibrillar structure with the disorganized tendon structure. And the way it does that, it looks at the stability of the echo pattern over those 600 successive images and correlates that with the 3D ultrastructure integrity. Um, and so again, while grayscale B mode is fantastic, for me, combining that with UTC was great, and seeing it done at a very high level with, again, back to the wisdom of crowd, seeing it done at a very high level with Jared. But then, it was had conversations with Seth O'Neill and followed his work and his presentations. And I'm like, man, if, these guys are really smart, they're using this technology, I need to investigate further to see if it's something that I want to do. Um, and so once we decided to step away from team sport, although the budget is a little different in the private sector than in the team side, we decided to get one here at the Tendon Lab. And so spent a week over in the Netherlands with Hans van Schie, who he's a doctor of veterinary medicine. He's the one that's behind UTC. Phenomenal experience over in Sittard down in southern Netherlands, learning from him. And asking questions. And then, having one in the clinic is great, not only to provide care, but then also to continue just to try to answer questions. And so I'll have random questions on a Tuesday morning, and I'll go in and I'll scan my Achilles and, try to answer some of those questions. So, um, yeah, it's a divisive topic, but I think, when I don't know if we want to get into this, but it's like trying to correlate structure and pain and structure and function and all that stuff. It can get a little messy. And I just think we need to be very specific and understanding, the questions that we're trying to ask or the answers that we want, and not just taking the, low back literature and saying, okay, well, if you image 100 people off the street, 80% of them, have some form of low back issue on imaging, but they're all asymptomatic. So therefore imaging doesn't matter. I have a problem with that. And I think that's where a lot of this stemmed from, unfortunately. And then obviously some of the early work on, the donut and the hole. And again, it's phenomenal work. They're phenomenal researchers. I'm not saying they're not. I'm just saying that, wanting to answer some of these or continue and investigate some of these questions instead of just saying it's a done deal and structure doesn't matter.
um, yeah, so that's where you feel that it gets so divisive. Is if you're in there looking at structure, you have camps of people that are like, why are you even looking at structure? It doesn't matter.
Yeah, both, in the clinic, but then also serial imaging too. And so there are some questions that we need to continue to ask. Um, and so again, I reserve the right to change my mind when better information becomes available, right? And you're trying to be less wrong in the approach. But I just think I have a problem with saying, structure and pain aren't necessarily correlated, and then therefore structure and function therefore aren't correlated. Uh, I do believe that the literature supports if you have structural change, your likelihood of pain or symptoms increases. But the literature also supports that the normalization of structure isn't necessary for someone to get out of pain. And I think that distinction is important. Where some of Daniel Cushman's work, granted that was in with B scale or B mode, which was awesome. We'd love to see some of that with UTC, but it was with B mode. And then Max Merkel is out of the Danish group, out of Peter's group in Copenhagen, and some of his recent work just looked at some of these changes in the tendon when it is overloaded, and the increasing in thickness and the increase in blood flow, and being able to detect that early on could potentially increase the likelihood of success in getting rid of symptoms or not developing symptoms. So yeah, man, I just structure and pain gets messy. I just think we need to make sure that we're asking the right questions.
Yeah. Okay. So how do you, when someone's coming into you and you're gonna scan and you're gonna see something on the imaging, how does that conversation look? How do you explain this to me? So I think I did it the other day with someone who knows nothing about structure and pain correlations, and it's a hard thing to do to someone who's not in the world. It's just like, yeah, the low back stuff. There's a lot of people with pathology in their low back and they have no symptoms, but with a tendon that, like in Achilles or Patellar, that's highly loaded, maybe there's more likelihood of symptoms. And Um, yeah. How do you have that conversation with people when you're scanning their tendons to look at structure? What do you tell them the point of it is?
Think you have to start by getting an understanding of where they're currently at from a psychological standpoint. And granted, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not saying that. But if somebody comes in and they're very hypersensitive and they're so concerned and they have this, almost kinesiophobic type approach in conversation, then I know that the language I use and how we describe imaging and the findings and this and that can have a drastic impact on their life essentially. And we need to take that serious because what we say matters, and the language we use and how we describe things to anybody, not just the person that has high levels of kinesiophobia. Um, and so just being extremely mindful of how we're describing it, what we say, and emphasizing, yeah, we can help. Like, loading is going to help. We can help get you out of pain. We can help get you back. And you never want to, lie to somebody and say, yeah, you've got a full rupture, but we can fix it. Like, I'm not going to say that per se, but it's emphasizing, what can be done, as well as being very particular in how you're describing what's going on. Um, and so I think to answer your question, when I've tried to share what UTC is to people, I've used a tree farm analogy actually, where it's like if you're taking a drone or if you're flying over a tree farm and you're taking pictures every, zero point 0.2 millimeters. Um, if you see these aligned trees in a row, you're saying, okay, these trees are a little bit, they're really strong. The farm's running really well. But if you start to see, the trees are wavy back and forth, and some are leaning one way, some are leaning the other. Maybe a recent storm rolled through, and they've got some work to do to get back to a good state. Or if you see, the young trees, the saplings, maybe that's the type 3, the echo type 3, where they're still growing, or it's patchwork, trying to repair a tendon. And if there's no trees, it's more of that echo type 4. So again, I probably described that poorly, but I think you get my point of trying to provide an analogy of saying we're just taking a look at inside the tendon to see if there's some things that we can do or can help make sure that we're doing exactly what this tendon needs to get back to a good spot.
Hmm. Yeah, I've never heard that analogy, but no, I like that one. Um, yeah. Uh, okay, so you go through that. You image if you image these people's tendons. Um, are you always looking at both sides, even if there's just one-sided pain?
Yep. Yep, yep. Some of the literature just there's changes on one side, even when the other side's symptomatic, and we know that changes can occur structurally prior to symptoms. And so, even if somebody isn't having symptoms on one side, we do want to get a representation of where they're at, even for future. Hopefully they're coming back to see us and continuing to progress their loading, and so try to look at both sides.
What do you explain to them why? They come in, they have right Achilles pain. You're like, I'm going to image your left tendon too. How do you explain that to people?
Uh, maybe it's just the population that I've seen. But a lot of them could get it completely when they're like, "Oh, yeah, I wanna check that one to make sure that one's in a good spot too," and, I think the whole symmetry piece, while I don't believe that everybody needs to be perfectly symmetrical, I haven't had any issues with anybody saying, "Why are you doing that? That's not my involved side." Typically just say we wanna be able to compare the 2 sides.
Um, if they MRIs, is that ever anything you're interested in? If you have access to UTC, looking at their MRIs or them getting them?
Sure. I mean, I can't, prescribe or recommend an MRI per se, but some of my medical doctor physician colleagues can, and so sometimes they're needed to evaluate maybe bony edema if they have insertional Achilles tendinopathy, or maybe at the inferior pole of the patellar tendon. Um, particularly in, systemic tendon disorders, maybe it's enthesitis, maybe there is some, systemic issues going on, and getting an MRI to evaluate, some of the insertion, would be helpful. Differential diagnosis potentially, maybe around the knee, and again, a good clinical exam can help, differentially diagnose. Um, but at the same time, an example that comes to mind is there was actually a tibial stress reaction in a cross country runner that came in to see me. A very interesting presentation and case. But anyways, I just said, look, man, this isn't a tendon issue. I think this is XYZ. you know, here's some options. And he ended up getting back to me a couple weeks later, and he said, "Yeah, I got an MRI. It was exactly that, and had some deloading, and able to run this cross country season." So it definitely is warranted in certain differential cases, even if the clinical exam points to something. It's still, depending on what it is, it's important to get that to rule out anything else. So definitely collaborative and working closely with physicians and sports medicine docs, and their skill set is slightly different than what we can provide. So
Is there anything you've seen? Uh, so with this UTCs, if someone comes into you with Patellar or Achilles, um, maybe if you could look back before you had access to this type of imaging, um, are there things that you've caught that you maybe wouldn't be aware of if you didn't have this type of imaging? And the one that comes to mind for me is the plantaris influence on the Achilles. Otherwise, what other things have you maybe seen on the UTC that would have been pretty hard to spot otherwise?
yeah, that's a great question, and that's something that I continue to ask every day, even when we have an eval. It's okay. Well, what would be my decision making process if I didn't have this? And many times you end up at a very similar answer where they need, especially if they haven't had loading, right? Like we both know that you need to load a tendon, or else it forgets it's a tendon, and so that is often the first line of defense, and we often arrive to that. Regardless of the technology that we're using. That said, there are certain cases, and you mentioned one of them. If there are posterior medial side changes, or depending on the plantaris morphology, if they do have changes at certain aspects of the tendon, there's tenderness along the medial pillar. Imaging can be helpful in understanding, is it more of the plantaris related mid portion Achilles tendinopathy, and what we would do to then intervene on that versus if it was something else. Um, I would say paratendon has also been helpful. I've had a few of those cases come in the clinic, where with UTC, there's sort of like a halo sign around the periphery of the tendon. That's helpful. Um, the one that's always interesting is somebody coming in and they have an MRI report, and it's, listed as a partial tear of the tendon. And I ask them, well, what happened? And they just say, well, nothing happened, just over time started to bother me. I would say, obviously, having suspicion of typically needing some type of mechanism or enticing event to have collagen disruption or partial tearing. And so again, is UTC needed for that? Not necessarily, but you're able to, get a snapshot picture, and with the understanding of the different echotypes, you can say, okay, this is definitely more of a chronic tendinopathy versus an acute partial tear, or intrasubstance tear, or longitudinal tear, or being able to differentiate even just the different types of tears via UTC is also a value aspect. Um, and so it's again having a algorithmic approach in a way, and that's sort of how my brain works, of going down these different paths of a yes no question. Okay, go to this answer. Yes no, go to that answer. And so UTC is a part of that process. But it's a good question, and I think again the more research we can do, both in the trenches and academic wise, a combination of those two, I think we're going to find that there are other scenarios that, UTC can be helpful for. And that's again part of the motivation for me is using it in the clinic every day, but then also having the potential capacity to conduct some research simultaneously.
Yeah. Okay. This idea on that partial tear versus like the regular tendinosis or degeneration. Um, that's where I go because I don't have. If I have a conversation with someone, I'm always asking if there was an event. Was there like a pop? Was there a tweak or something? And if there wasn't, I'm like maybe just a regular tendinopathy. But you're able to, so with the UTC, you can actually kind of pick out maybe where it would be a suspected partial tear versus like if they just say my Achilles hurts and it's at the mid portion, you can get that UTC scan and you could maybe pick up if there is some type of tear in the tendon.
Yes, and depending on which classification system you use to describe tears, right? There's the full rupture, partial rupture, intrasubstance tear, which is in the central part of the tendon, or not extending to the border, and then some of your longitudinal or your split tears. And so with UTC, being able to look at the different echotypes and how they're arranged, you can stage the injury. And so with the healing process, and I'm not smart enough to get into the whole, exactly what's going on with the cascade of healing and the MMP1 and MMP3 and the fluctuations, et cetera. But what happens throughout an acute event, there is a healing process that takes place. And if it happens how it should, then there are certain parameters or even ratios that you can look at of what is the echotype 3 to echotype 4. And, is it a 1-to-1 ratio? Is there significantly more, echotype 3 than echotype 4? And how does that change over time? What is the periphery around the actual lesion? Are there a lot of clotted, echotype 2 throughout the tendon? And so there's certain patterns that you can look at to try to pick up some clues on what's going on. Is this more of a partial tear, one event, somebody stepped wrong, or is it more of a chronic degenerative tendinopathy? So a piece of the puzzle. Obviously, collecting information from the subjective with the client on it, but UTC can help add some clues as far as getting an understanding of what are those echotypes in the area of interest or region of interest.
I recently, I was recently working with a guy, patellar tendon, had it for years, surgeries and everything. It was a collaborative thing, and one guy I was with just told him straight up, like, 6 months. And I was on board because I'm like, this guy, it seems like he's been kind of up and down with rehab. Just gave him a time frame, 6 months, 6 months, good rehab, and then maybe we're looking at getting back to sport. It makes me, I think in that case, very useful because he's been like 1 month rehab and then tries sports and then it blows up. And then it's like, no, we need a long-term approach. When you talk about staging the injury, this is one of the problems I've always had with tendons, how it's like when you have a muscle strain or you have a bone stress injury, there's time frames. They give you a time frame of this amount of weeks or this amount of months. But tendons, there's like, we don't have time frames when someone's tendon hurts. When you do this UTC scan, you can kind of stage it based off the echotypes. Have you, maybe it's just a speculation in your head, but I'm like, do you think we'll get to a point where it's like, here's how your tendon looks based on the healing process, and it'll probably go through this maturation and healing at 6 months or at 8 months? Do you think we're getting closer to that? And I don't want to take it to say what their pain symptoms will be or their function symptoms. I'm just saying just the structure of the tendon. Yeah, do you think that we're any closer to having timeframes of that?
I think so. And I say that because, first having to agree upon the premise of, that the tendon can adapt, because I think there are some discussions on, can a tendon even adapt? I do believe a tendon can adapt, and I've seen that even anecdotally with serial UTC over time. Um, Being able to quantify the echotypes is also helpful to be able to get an understanding, particularly in the region of interest. What percentage in this couple millimeter space at the mid portion that was previously 50% of this echotype 1 and 30% of this echotype 3. Now, a month later, we've re-imaged that area and we've seen some drastic improvements in the echotype 1 and decreases in the echotype 3. To me, that says there's continued healing, quote unquote, going on. And with that, I think you can maybe project certain timelines, but the challenge is, as we talked about, normalization of structure isn't required for somebody to get out of pain or out of symptoms. And so, making sure that we're clear on what the goal is and making sure we're not just saying, okay, we have to get this structure to change. Like, I believe structure matters, but like, I'm not married to it. There's many other important things. And the example I would give would be, maybe somebody's pain is decreasing, their function is increasing, but their structure is getting worse. In a sedentary person, all they care about is pain. They pain free, they're great. Who cares what their structure is? They probably don't, even though I probably would. In an elite athlete, yes, function matters. Yes, symptoms matter, but I also think the structure matters. And so if that structure is going down while their function and pain are improving, we need to make sure that we keep an eye on that. Conversely, it's if pain is staying about the same, their function is improving maybe slightly, but the structure is improving, I would say, okay, we're going to turn a corner at some point And again, while structure normalization is not required for pain to resolve, I do think it matters when it comes to the function piece. Simply because if we look at the tensile capacities of the echo type 3s or the type 3 collagen compared to the type 1 collagen, and like the echo type 3 is just an immature, not able to withstand these tensile strains or capacities that the echo type 1 or 2 are. And so simply just basing our argument on that, if we think that having more echo type 1 and 2 is probably a good thing. Um, and so I know that's gotten away from your question on the staging piece, but I think if we can continue to ask questions on and better understand what UTC is telling us, then I think we can get closer to answering questions of, with this echo type profile after this your type, injury, we anticipate, this restoring, X amount of time down the road. So yeah, maybe that's a little outside my circle of competence. But at the same time, again, I think the more we track this and better, more feedback loops we have, the closer we can get to getting to the point that we want to get to.
Yeah. Um, when you are hey, last one on structure, I want to get to talk about function. When you are looking at someone's structure in those athletes, those higher level athletes that you would like to see it the structure improve, how long does this take? Um, if you're gonna rescan them, is it every like month? Is it every 2 months? How long before you start to see like significant positive improvements in structure?
Sure. I do think it maybe depends on maybe what the pathology, if it is, an acute disruption of the collagen, maybe that time period or time course is slightly different than if it is more of like a chronic change. um, as we know, tendons take time, both from a function, symptoms, but also structural standpoint. Sometimes structure, like a lot of the studies we've seen, is structure is not even changing after 12 weeks or 52 weeks. Some of that was done in B mode, or a lot of it was done in B mode, although there are some UTC papers looking at that. Um, I do think, though, the more information coming out in the next few years on UTC will continue to support the value in showing there are some structural changes, some collagen reorganization and alignment happening at these regions of interest after an insult to that region, pending or assuming that the loading, because again, the language of tendons is load and mechanotransduction, how we're speaking to the tendon and the magnitude and the rate and the duration and frequency, etc. Uh, that's the language to lay down collagen and improve the alignment. And so, anecdotally, we've seen changes in a few weeks, 4 weeks. Um, there's some, I'm sure you're aware of the literature on the increase in echo type 2 after, a training camp period. I think that was in volleyball, maybe, or rugby athletes. So you do have some transient changes or fluctuations in the echo type 2. But as far as, greater than the minimal detectable change on the echo type 3s changing and echo type 1 improvements, usually we would rescan maybe 4 to 6 weeks. But I think that also just depends on who the athlete is. Are they an athlete that has significant structural disorganization and there's higher levels of concern? Maybe we want more frequent feedback loops. Again, not to dictate or drive the entire recommendation, but again, adding an understanding of what's going on with the ultrastructure inside the tendon. So I don't have an answer as far as what's the perfect time frame, because I do think it is context specific. Um, but yeah, anecdotally, we've seen some changes in a few weeks.
Mhm. Okay. Um, we get to the function piece. So like you said earlier, it's all about kind of assessing tendon health, and you have this questionnaire to maybe get a feel for their psychological factors. And you have the structure, you're imaging with UTC, and then that Myotone Pro function around the tendon. So the things you're looking at, why, yeah, I guess maybe why have you arrived at this when it gets to function? So with the Achilles, you're looking at that seated maximal isometric strength. And then you had some other things you're saying: explosive strength, repeated hop test, single leg counter movement jump, hero raise endurance. Yeah, where is your head at for why are you looking at these things in terms of the function? Yeah.
I think we first need to start by, the lens that I view this through is that tendons act as a buffer and to muscles, and so therefore force production. If we're talking Achilles, the calf complex is important to assess and get an understanding of, whereas the quads would be for the patellar tendon. That's my bias, is that tendons work as a buffer to muscles, and there's some literature that supports that. And so getting an understanding of the muscle function, plantar flexor function, both the peak and the rate, very simply. So how high is that curve relative to your body weight? And how quickly, or what is the slope of that curve to get to that point? Um, in elite athletes, I do think isokinetic is important and critical, but isometric can also provide some information on, does this person need to improve the calf generating capacity or their peak force of their calf or plantar flexors? Um, so that's the max isometric strength. I would say the other one would simply be reactive strength. And so sort of those two, in addition to the strength endurance, but reactive strength is just your tendon's ability to, elastically store and return energy. And so we do a repeat hop test, looking at elastic qualities of the Achilles tendon. That quality is different than the peak force. And so in an athlete, the greater the reactive strength, the greater that they're able to change direction, etc. And if we agree that a tendon works as a buffer to muscles, and also that tendons become compliant in a tendinopathic state, I gave the analogy that I stole from Karin, that in a tendinopathic Achilles tendon is like trying to dribble a flat basketball. Like it doesn't return energy as well as a normally inflated basketball, and so reactive strength would be able to quantify that function. And then the third piece is the strength endurance. And so the heel raise endurance test, which does have some literature to support it. Um, the other two I threw in there, we look at just for a more, comprehensive approach. If they are an athlete, it's getting an understanding of what their explosive strength are and their dynamic strength, which, again, I'm using, some of Lachlan James's definitions on how he's classified these different types of strength. And so we'll look at that more for completeness, but directly for the tendon per se, it's what is their max isometric strength, what is their reactive strength, and then what is their strength endurance.
Oh, the strength endurance piece. Um, yeah, I know there's quite a bit of literature on that. People with this Achilles tendinopathy are kind of lacking there. What do you think's going on? Why do they have this deficit in endurance of the plantar flexors?
I think there's literature looking at decreased neural drive to the calf complex, and um, pain can cause a host of issues, locally, but also globally. And so I think it's a combination of things of why it's potentially causing decreased endurance. With the calf is active, 4 times body weight peak load in the Achilles tendon when you walk. The rate of loading obviously is significantly higher, and when you run, obviously, both of those numbers jump up, and so the calf is active all the time. Particularly the soleus, and so is there a reason? Is that matter? I think it does. Um, and then, yeah, I don't even know where I was going there, Jake. So I might have to cut that out.
No, I got it. No, I got it. It's kind of a no, you answered it.
That's a tough question. Yeah, that's a tough question though, as far as like why. I think it's something to do with pain, maybe. Uh,
Yeah, because I had what's his name? Gabe Gabriel Fernandez
yep.
on the lateral gas. He had a paper on lateral gastroc, and he was saying his review of literature is you see a consistent drop in the heel endurance, but the lack of strength is kind of like hit or miss. Sometimes they are lacking in peak force, sometimes they're not. But the one
Mm,
consistency is the heel raise endurance, and I was like, that is interesting.
mm.
Okay, so you're looking at, we talked about Achilles there and calf, the max isometric strength, and then the reactive strength, and then the strength endurance. What are you looking at for patellar tendon?
Similar approach where again, if we had a HUMAC or a Biodex, obviously we would do some isokinetics. We just do we actually do two setups. One is the seated, so you're at the 90 degrees of hip flexion, seated off the bench, doing a max isometric with the knee at 90 degrees in that inline position, just with the dynamo. We also use the force frame to look at the hip in a 0 degree position, so hip extension more in like that kicker position, and so that's just based on some of the literature and changes in changes in hip flexion angle. And how that can potentially impact at the knee, and we'll look at both of those measures for our peak output. We'll also look at the reactive strength via the hop test, but what we found is that depending upon the strategy of the athlete, they can sometimes hide in their ability to, hide that pathology in the knee by self-organizing around it to complete the task a different way. But where we do see often patellar tendinopathy pop up is in a single leg CMJ or double leg, but primarily single leg CMJ in some of their eccentric capacities. And so particularly looking at the eccentric peak velocity or how willing the athlete is to drop into that bottom position of a CMJ. And so the single leg CMJ more for the knee and patella, where the hop test, more for the calf, I would say. Um, there's not a strength endurance measure that we use for the quad as of right now. So that would be one that we don't get.
Okay, getting to the the rehab, and maybe this is just like personal preference on your end, but there's for both patellar and Achilles, there's so many different ways of doing it. So like the Alfredson early on with Achilles, and then with patellar, you have like I guess patellar and Achilles 4 stage process. You have like daily isometric holds versus like 3 times a week. Where do you lean towards with these people that are, yeah? What type of rehab are you suggesting that people follow?
This is getting back to the whole definition of tendon health, in my opinion, where being clear on what our goal is, and separating the adaptive response from the expected outcome. And so, maybe this is some recency bias. Scott Morrison is speaking at our tendon event, and so I've had some email exchanges with him. And the big thing he mentioned is, making sure that we're understanding, are your imposed demands aligning with your desired outcome? Uh, and so, I think we need to start with separating what are we trying to cause via our interventions, or what are we trying to do with our interventions versus the expected outcome, and not confusing maybe the biological change, aka increased stiffness, with the functional result, decreasing pain or returning back to sport. So not confusing those two. um, because I do think those domains that we talk about the tendon health, like I do think domains are independent, even though they're inconsistently related. And we can't assume that improving one domain automatically improves the other, right? So if you improve the structure and you improve the function, that'll automatically improve the pain. I, I don't think so. And so I just bring that up because I think it's important for us to understand and bring the conversation back to, um, what are we trying to what's the adaptation that we're trying to elicit, and going from there. And so for me, I do believe, getting back to just the answer to the question, the strain based approach, and strain being the primary mechanical stimulus that drives tendon adaptation, and um, the magnitude, the rate, the duration, frequency of strain, all of that determines whether the response is healthy, or whether it's, pathological. And while that 4.5 to 6.5% has been, deemed the sweet spot, I do think there's some nuance with that. So, um, anyways, for going back to specific loading recommendations, in general, I do a combination of the isometrics, high force isometrics, combination of the heavy slow resistance or modified Kongsgaard program. Um, the BFR, I think is actually going to continue to come out with some supporting literature on it. It, you know, it's a really utilizing those three, BFR, HSR, HFI. My colleagues would often joke. They would say, you have all these, 3-letter acronyms that you use for tendons, but it's a little easier to remember. So, um, Yeah, man, like any intervention, it's tailoring it to what their goals are, working backwards from that, and, meeting the person where they're at, but being very clear on what adaptive response are we trying to elicit. Mid portion Achilles tendinopathy, likely decreased stiffness or increased compliance. Let's do an intervention that will improve that stiffness. Maybe we want to do the Berlin method because that's been shown to improve stiffness in tendons. Although nuance, that was done in healthy tendons, and maybe pathological tendons have a different mechanosensitivity. And so there's a lot of questions that we still need to answer. Um, a couple of things that I want to flag up when it comes to the interventions. Another researcher out of Copenhagen, Anne-Sophie Agregard, looked at moderate slow and heavy slow. Again, this is a non-elite population, and both in groups improved over 12 weeks in structure, function, subjective. I think this was in patellar tendinopathy, and I just think shining light on that, and her thought was that training volume may be more important than load magnitude, and high volume of more moderate loads may be sufficient to induce enough strain to the fibroblast to stimulate the synthesis of collagen, which is important for tendon healing. So I do think we just need more research in tendinopathic tendons, because a lot of the heavy traditional loading had, like, that research been done in healthy tendons. Same thing with blood flow restriction, right? Like my bias is towards using BFR, but I shared an office with somebody who did his PhD in BFR, in Detroit. So, I just think for elite athletes who have high levels of mechanical strain, and maybe their tendon cells are saturated from this mechanical stimulus, what's another alternative to be able to provide a potential sufficient stimulus for adaptation? Okay, BFR works via more of the, hypoxia, metabolic and cascade stimulus. And so rather than adding more water to the already full cup of mechanical loading, let's get that same adaptation or similar adaptation using a different pathway. Um, and so recently just diving into the, hypoxic induced factor 1 alpha, I think it's called, and getting understanding of that intermittent frequent occlusion and hypoxia can cause an increase in this, hypoxic induced factor that can actually be beneficial for tendon adaptation. There's the study from that Danish group that came out last month, just looking at heavy slow resistance in BFR, and there's some value in it from a pain reduction standpoint for sure. But I do think that we'll continue to see some value in its use in tendon cases. So yeah, happy to chat about one in particular, but I think those
Yeah.
are kind of summarizes it.
No, that's seems to see would be where I think as well with the. So you talk about the high force isometrics, heavy slow resistance, um, but uh, are you catering that? So if you have someone with, like, you're suspecting a more compliant tendon that doesn't respond well to HSR or the high force isometrics, are you just taking the loads down to kind of reach a point where, like, they you feel like they accept it positively, and then progressing that to try to get heavier and heavier?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think because we are still uncertain of, you know, I'm not measuring strain at different loads in clinic yet. And so, um, maybe somebody's 50% of their MVC is actually 7% strain. And so that 50% of their MVC or a lighter load is actually stimulatory for adaptation. And so for me, especially if somebody is in pain, looking at that being the first limiting factor that we need to consider or filter our response or intervention through. And so 45-second isometrics, like, again, very tribal when you bring up that discussion, but I do think sustained positions, loading the tendon in some form or fashion is often beneficial, particularly in the early stages. One, to build confidence. Again, two, to get some stimulatory effects into the tendon, and start this, motor reprogramming or whatever you want to call it, right? Like, I think the moderate slow is working because you're getting these people to exercise consistently and frequently frequently, regardless of the load that they're using. Um, and so that's absolutely advantageous. I do think, particularly in the more elite population, getting to some of the heavier loading, I do think there is value in the heavier loading. Again, but it's being specific or particular in what is the adaptive response that we're trying to elicit, because we can get somebody out of pain by just giving them a hug, right? And so we give a variety of parameters to get somebody out of pain, but we need to be very specific in the parameters to cause certain adaptive responses. So yeah, just get people moving, get people loading that area, and what they can tolerate.
Okay, where do you stand with this compression? These positions of, I'm thinking like insertion Achilles, deep dorsiflexion, patellar tendon, maybe as you bend the knee really far. Are you, when you're training with these HSR, with the high force isometrics, or even with BFR, are you like getting into these deeper positions, or are you avoiding compression?
I think it depends on their pathology. Like, what is the rate limiter, right? If they have like, insertional Achilles tendinopathy, the literature does support minimizing some of that deeper end range dorsiflexion to minimize compression. The challenge is that same position is also the position where we can produce the most force. And so at some point, you do want to get into those positions. Um, my first side note, my first Con Ed course after PT school was Greg Lehman's Reconciling Pain and Biomechanics. And, Greg is awesome for a variety of reasons, but he asked a lot of hard questions. And, anyways, we just talked about his framework of calming it down and then building it back up. Like, that's always resonated with me. And I think this is a very similar situation where you calm it down, you're still loading it, but you're doing it in a range that doesn't flare it up, calm it down, and then eventually work back into that same range. Now, if there are chronic cartilage changes, or if there are chronic changes that are just not going to change, maybe we have to create some adaptive strategies, because you can't just calm it down and then load into that position. Well, the chronic change is still there. If it is, like I said, cartilage or some other pathology, and so it's taking into consideration maybe some of these other pathologies that could inform the positions that we would want to load in. So more of like the second order thinking of what are the consequences of training this position, not just for the tendon, but for some of the other local joints or tissues.
Okay, you said this earlier on the volume piece, and that reminds me of that Kongsgaard study for patellar tendon, where I think it was like 3 days a week. They were just doing crazy amounts of quad volume, and they saw that patellar tendon increase in fibril density of like 70% or something. Um, and that's always a question I've had, is like, what volume for the rehab? What is the point? Do you have any speculations of like, okay, a tendon needs to be strained, a tendon needs like load to know it's a tendon, to lay down new like healthy collagen, normalize the tendon, hopefully get people back to whatever they're doing, or their sports. Volume, how do you decide volume? What do you think the point of, like, what is low volume doing versus high volume? Yeah, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I'll need to be careful as far as staying within my circle of competence of this one. But I mean, just thinking about Anne Sophie's study on the moderate slow loading, and why does moderate slow work? There's an adequate mechanical threshold that is reached, and that threshold changes in unhealthy tendon because they have a different mechanosensitivity. Um, and I think that's just what it comes down to, right? Is there is a certain threshold that needs to be reached that will cause adaptation. And when a tendon is healthy or pathological, that threshold may change. And that's why it's challenging to project or infer that healthy tendon research automatically is transferred over to unhealthy tendon. Um, and so, I think there's still more questions that we need to answer, but I think for me, at least, it comes down to understanding what that threshold is. Like, what is that mechanical threshold that we need to reach?
Yeah. Okay. You got time for a couple more questions?
I do. Yeah. I
Okay,
think my family
perfect.
just got home, so you might hear some kids screaming in the background, but that's
Okay.
okay.
Okay. You One thing I wanted to ask was, you spent time with you spent time with a lot of people that I've read a lot of their work. podcasts, or even I went out to London to see Jared and John. If you could give me the one takeaway you've taken from all these places. So you spent time with Jared and John in London. You've spent time in Copenhagen with that tendon group. You spent some time with Karin Silbernagel in Delaware, and then recently you went to Iowa with Ruth Chimeni. Is that how you say her last name? Yeah. What are the takeaways you've taken? These are 4 spots I just listed. What are the things you went in and then you left with like a major takeaway?
Sure. This new season of life has been great for a variety of reasons, but one of which is being able to spend time with people much smarter than I and learning from them. And I would say one common theme from all places has been how intricately everyone has worked with other disciplines. Whether it's Jared working with John and some of the, going back and forth with between those two. And in Copenhagen they have this building. Each floor has different disciplines, and they have these amazing researchers that are studying everything from circadian rhythm of tendons to heavy slow loading or moderate slow loading. And um, at Delaware, Karin introduced me to Stephanie Cohn, who was speaking at our event in April. And Stephanie's background is in biomedical engineering. And they showed me a cool study they're doing looking at hormone fluctuations and the effect that has on tendon strain in runners and female runners. And so just the working together with different disciplines was present in all of those visits. Um, the other piece is just there's all those researchers are and clinicians are very upfront about we need more research in these areas. We need more research in unhealthy tendons, and need to continue to ask questions. So yeah, phenomenal experience, learned a ton. But I would say working, how much they've worked with other disciplines and how much they continue to ask questions, particularly as it pertains to, how we should treat the loading and unloading of unhealthy tendons.
Do you feel like that's a hard thing when you I mean, maybe that's not the point now, but when you read through a piece of tendon research, um, if it's on healthy tendons, how do you reconcile what does this mean for pathological tendons?
It's a challenge, and just going back to, it's obviously valuable, but I think it's a challenge in immediately inferring it, um, because I do think there are differences in the mechanosensitivity that's required to reach a certain threshold of adaptation. Um, that said, I don't know that we're, maybe we're not far off in some of our interventions. Like I still think we'll need to do heel raises for Achilles pathology. But maybe some of the parameters or maybe some of the things that we thought we needed to do, we don't necessarily need to do, such as maybe the heavy loading for initial adaptations for Achilles tendinopathy. So yes, I do think we can't automatically infer the results, but they can help inform at least giving us an anchor of where to start. Because if not, like what else are you going to anchor to? I'd rather anchor to the same tissue, even if it is healthy or unhealthy, than anchor to a completely different, positional tendon like the anterior tibialis, inferring some of that, unhealthy literature to the Achilles. So
Yeah, yeah. Okay, you have this tendon summit taking place Traverse City in April? Is it in April?
yep, yep,
Yeah.
April 25th.
Okay. Yeah, what made you want to get this together? So you got a bunch of like really, I mean, really good researchers out there, practitioners. What made you want to set this up?
Yeah, I mean, so we're describing it as a working meeting for practitioners and researchers fluent in tendon concepts who want to challenge discussion and refine them together. And so what that means is we don't want to just simply get into a room and rehash these same concepts. We want to have dialogue like this, Jake, where we can go back and forth and be vulnerable and say, yeah, I don't really know. What do you think? Or what is your research leaning towards? And getting people, the best in the world who are understand or in this space every single day, good things will come from that if people are willing to be vulnerable and admit when they don't know something. That's sort of the premise that we're building this on, is trying to create this intimate setting for us to ask challenging questions, and people being willing to discuss and refine them together. So we have a fantastic lineup spanning multiple tendon labs across the world, and then we'll spend a few days here in Traverse City. So we have about 10 spots left, and so not to plug the event, but if if you are interested, I would definitely recommend registering soon. So we're really excited for it.
So you have the first day there's like a little like get together at night, and the next day you have these lectures. The last day, what's taking place on that last day?
Yeah, great question. So the way we have it set up, we list it the April 24th through 26th, but really what it is the evening of the 24th, people come in. The primary day is the 25th, a Saturday. So, 8 to 4:30. We have a hard stop before 4:30. We have a hard stop there. That way, if people need to fly out, we want to. We want to make sure that we've been thoughtful in curating the timing of everything because everybody has a lot going on. And then Sunday morning, we have a coffee and clinic. And so that will take place inside the Tendon lab where we'll have, a variety of technologies and some things that we'll demo, but then also discuss some challenging cases and, great opportunity to get a bit more practical and take some of the things that we discussed on Saturday and put it into practice on Sunday. But again, it's a few hours Sunday morning and it's quote unquote optional for people just if they do want to stick around and experience Traverse City and all it has to offer. Um, and then being able to fly out in the afternoon. So yeah, coffee and clinic inside the Tendon lab on Sunday morning.
All right, Trent, this has been a lot of you answered a lot of my own personal questions, and I spent a morning with you at Tendon Lab, and it was like, yeah, you got a lot of things going on that are really fascinating. Tell people where to find you. Tell people where to find that summit, where to find you online. Anything else you want to say about Tendon Lab? Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, appreciate the opportunity, Jake. I'm most active, I would say, on Instagram and LinkedIn, just at Trent Salo. Website, trentsalo.com. The tendonlab.com is our just our clinic name. And then Traverse City Tendon Summit is the name of the event. And it's just traversecitytendonsummit.com. So pretty easy to find. Just shoot me an email. If anybody has any questions, let me know where I was wrong. Or areas that we need to I need to brush up on. So looking for some feedback to help improve my circle of competence with this.
Are you so I've suggested and I will continue in the future. Are you also in you travel to Florida too? Do you hold a clinic in Florida as well or just Traverse City?
I do. So working backwards and trying to create a lifestyle that we want, and it's really cold here in the winter. Phenomenal in summer, but Michigan is cold in the winter. And so, having gone to St. Augustine for PT school, a mentor of mine is the high performance director at the new USL soccer club in Jacksonville, and he has a small clinic. Performance science and rehab it's called. And so again, being a mentor of mine, learning from him, he said, hey, come down and we'll have a caseload for you. We'll try to build it up. And for me, it's being able to experience Florida in the summertime or in the wintertime and some warmer weather, but then being able to continue to learn in different environments and provide specialized tendon services in more than just Traverse City.
Yeah. Got it. All right, man. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. Appreciate it.